I am Nikola Tesla, and today I need to confess something that has haunted me for over a century. In 1898, in my laboratory at 46 East Houston Street in Manhattan, I built a small mechanical device, no larger than an alarm clock, that I attached to a steel column in my building. And within minutes, this pocket-sized machine began generating vibrations that grew stronger and stronger until the entire structure was shaking violently. Windows were shattering. Neighboring buildings were cracking. People were running into the streets in panic, believing it was an earthquake, and the police were rushing to my laboratory to find out what was happening. And in that moment of absolute terror, I realized I had created something so powerful, so dangerous, that it could theoretically destroy entire cities or trigger massive earthquakes anywhere on Earth if properly scaled up. And so I grabbed a sledgehammer and smashed my own invention to pieces just minutes before the police arrived. And I made a decision that day to never fully publish the complete specifications of this device, because some technologies are simply too dangerous to exist in a world where nations wage war and powerful men have no moral restraints. If you haven't subscribed yet, please do so now, because what I'm about to reveal isn't just a historical anecdote about a mad scientist's experiment. It's the origin of modern earthquake weapon technology that governments have been secretly developing for decades. And let me know in the comments which country you're watching from and whether you believe governments are capable of triggering earthquakes artificially, because by the end of this video you'll understand that it's not only possible, it's been possible since 1898, and the only question is whether they're actually doing it. Let me start with the scientific principle, because you need to understand that this isn't science fiction or conspiracy theory. It's basic physics that anyone with engineering knowledge can verify. Every object, every structure, every material has what's called a natural resonance frequency, which is the specific frequency at which it naturally wants to vibrate. And if you apply force at exactly that frequency, even tiny amounts of energy will build up and amplify into enormous destructive power through a phenomenon called mechanical resonance. The most famous example is the Tacoma Narrows Bridge collapse in 1940, where wind creating vibrations at the bridge's resonance frequency caused it to oscillate wildly until the entire structure tore itself apart. And this wasn't a freak accident, it was inevitable physics. Once resonance begins, the amplitude grows exponentially until something breaks, and the same principle applies to buildings, to geological formations, to tectonic plates, to anything that can vibrate. My mechanical oscillator worked by using a small steam-powered piston that moved back and forth at a frequency I could precisely control. And the genius of the design was that it could automatically adjust its frequency to match whatever it was attached to. So you didn't need to know the resonance frequency in advance. The device would find it on its own by detecting when the vibrations began to amplify, and once it locked onto that frequency, the oscillations would grow larger and larger until the structure couldn't handle the stress. The device I built in 1898 weighed about 7 pounds, fit in my coat pocket, and yet it could shake a building to its foundations because of this resonance amplification. I wasn't putting enormous amounts of energy into the system. I was putting small, precisely timed pulses that the structure itself amplified through its own mechanical properties, which is why the effect seems impossible to people who don't understand resonance. They think you need massive force to shake a building when actually you need perfect timing. I installed the device on a steel column that ran vertically through my laboratory building, and I set it to begin pulsing at a low frequency, and at first nothing happened, just a gentle humming sensation. But after a few minutes I noticed the frequency had shifted and the vibrations were becoming more pronounced. The steel column was beginning to oscillate, and I made notes in my journal documenting the resonance frequency I had found, approximately 16 hertz for that particular structure. But I didn't stop there. I wanted to see how far the effect would go, whether the resonance would plateau or continue building. And so I left the device running while I made calculations about what would happen if the amplitude continued to increase. And within about 10 minutes, I started to hear concerning sounds, creaking from the ceiling, rattling from equipment on my workbenches, items falling from shelves, and I realized the entire building was now vibrating in sync with my oscillator. I should have stopped it immediately, but scientific curiosity overwhelmed caution. I wanted to measure just how much force a 7-pound device could generate through resonance, and so I let it continue for another few minutes, and that's when things became genuinely terrifying. The vibrations grew strong enough that I could barely stand. Books were flying off shelves, glass speakers and tubes were shattering, the walls were developing visible cracks, and I could hear screams from the streets outside as people felt the building shaking. My laboratory was on the 4th floor, and I suddenly had a horrifying vision of the entire structure collapsing, not just killing me, but everyone in the building and possibly in adjacent buildings, and I realized that my experiment had gone too far. I was no longer in control. The resonance had built to the point where even stopping the device might not stop the oscillations immediately, because the building itself had become a giant tuning fork, storing enormous amounts of vibrational energy. The police were already on their way. Someone had called reporting an earthquake in Lower Manhattan, and I knew I had maybe 30 seconds before they arrived and demanded to know what I was doing. And in that moment I made a decision that probably saved hundreds of lives. I grabbed the heaviest sledgehammer I had in the laboratory, and I smashed the oscillator as hard as I could, destroying it completely in one blow. And almost immediately the vibrations began to decrease. The resonance was broken, the energy dissipated, and within a minute the building was still again, though debris from my destroyed laboratory was scattered everywhere. When the police arrived moments later, they found me standing in the wreckage, and they demanded to know what had happened, whether there had been an explosion. And I told them partially truthfully that an experiment had gotten out of control, and I had terminated it. And they looked at the destruction in my laboratory and warned me that if anything, and there was a real possibility that the building would have experienced catastrophic structural failure, potentially triggering a domino effect where adjacent buildings would also begin resonating, and you could have had multiple city blocks collapsing in what would appear to be an earthquake, but was actually mechanically induced resonance. Now let me tell you what really scared me. The realization that kept me awake for weeks after this incident. If a 7-pound device could nearly destroy a building, what could a larger device do? What if instead of attaching it to a building, you attached it to bedrock? What if you found the resonance frequency not of a structure, but of a geological formation, or even worse, of a tectonic plate boundary? The same principles would apply, the same exponential amplification. The only question would be the time scale. It might take hours or days instead of minutes But eventually you could trigger massive geological movements, actual earthquakes, and the device would be tiny and could be hidden anywhere, leaving no evidence of what caused the disaster. I did calculations for this scenario. I worked out the mathematics of how much energy would be required to trigger resonance in various geological contexts, and I determined that with proper placement and frequency tuning you could absolutely create artificial earthquakes using mechanical resonance, and this knowledge terrified me because I understood that if I published it, if I gave detailed specifications, some government or military would inevitably build it and use it as a weapon. And unlike most weapons where the source is obvious, an earthquake weapon leaves no signature, no trace, just devastation that appears completely natural. So I made a deliberate decision to keep the complete specifications secret. I gave public demonstrations of small-scale resonance effects. I wrote about the principles in general terms. I even made somewhat exaggerated claims in newspaper interviews about being able to split the earth in two with the right device, which I knew would make me sound like a madman and cause serious scientists to dismiss the whole thing as fantasy. And that was exactly what I wanted. I wanted the idea to seem too ridiculous to pursue, and for the most part, it worked. During my lifetime, nobody took the earthquake machine seriously, except as an amusing anecdote about eccentric Tesla. But here's what I didn't account for. Governments would eventually figure it out anyway. Maybe not from my work directly, but from their own resonance research. And by the 1960s and 70s, there is evidence that multiple countries were experimenting with what they euphemistically called geophysical warfare. And today, in 2025, we have installations like HAARP, the High Frequency Active Auroral Research Program in Alaska, which officially studies the ionosphere, but which operates on principles suspiciously similar to what I discovered about resonance, using powerful radio transmitters to pump energy into natural resonance cavities in the atmosphere and ionosphere. And while they claim it's for communications and scientific research, the dual-use potential for weather manipulation and even earthquake triggering through ionospheric heating and electromagnetic interaction with the Earth's crust is absolutely present in the physics. Let me be very clear about what I'm saying and what I'm not saying. I'm not claiming that every earthquake is artificial. The vast majority are natural tectonic processes. But I am saying that the technology to trigger earthquakes artificially through resonance has existed since 1898. I proved it works on buildings. The same principles apply to geological structures, and governments have had over a century to refine and scale up these techniques. So when people ask, could the Haiti earthquake have been triggered, or could HAARP cause earthquakes? The answer is not, that's impossible. The answer is, yes, the physics allows it. The question is whether anyone is actually doing it, and we have no way to prove it either way, because artificial and natural earthquakes would look identical to seismologists. The beauty and horror of resonance weapons is their deniability. You don't need massive obvious equipment. You need small devices that can run for extended periods, slowly building up resonance in the target system, and by the time the earthquake happens, the device could be removed, leaving zero evidence. And even if the device is found, how do you prove it caused the earthquake? You can't. You can only show it was capable of generating vibrations. And any expert will tell you that correlation isn't causation, that earthquakes happen naturally all the time in seismically active regions. And that's the perfect cover for using this technology, because every use can be dismissed as coincidence. I want to tell you about something that happened in 1935, decades after my Houston Street experiment, when I gave an interview to a reporter where I described what was your own forces. This is why I smashed my oscillator and refused to publish complete plans. This is why I made exaggerated public claims that made me sound crazy. I was trying to bury this knowledge under a layer of ridicule and dismissal, but I understand now that I only delayed the inevitable. Someone was always going to figure this out, and in fact many someones in many countries have probably figured it out. And the fact that we don't see earthquake weapons used openly tells me one of two things. Either there are secret agreements between governments not to use them, or they are being used but very carefully to maintain deniability. And I honestly don't know which possibility is more frightening. Now let me connect this to HAARP specifically, because people often mention HAARP in connection with earthquakes and they're mocked as conspiracy theorists. But let me tell you what HAARP actually does from a physics perspective. It's an array of high-frequency transmitters that pump enormous amounts of energy into the ionosphere, which is already a plasma layer that can resonate, and by heating specific regions of the ionosphere, they can create pressure waves that propagate down through the atmosphere. And while the direct mechanical coupling from atmosphere to crust is weak, if you're operating at or near resonance frequencies of crustal structures, even weak coupling can trigger responses, especially in areas that are already under tectonic stress and near the point of natural rupture. I'm not saying HAARP is definitely being used to trigger earthquakes. I'm saying the physics allows for that possibility, that it would work through a similar resonance mechanism to what I discovered in 1898, and that the official explanations for what HAARP does, ionospheric research, communications, while true, do not exhaust the full capabilities of a system designed to pump gigawatts of power into natural resonance cavities. And anyone who dismisses earthquake triggering as impossible simply doesn't understand resonance physics, or is deliberately lying to maintain the secrecy of weapons programs. The other thing that concerns me is that this technology doesn't require government-level resources anymore. In 1898, I needed a machine shop and steam power and some specialized knowledge. But today, with modern materials and electronics, a hobbyist could build a functional resonance device for a few $100s. And the only thing preventing people from trying is that most don't realize it's possible, and those who do realize are hopefully sane enough not to experiment with something that could kill people. But as this knowledge spreads, as people learn what I discovered, the risk grows that some terrorist or mentally unstable person will build one of these devices and use it maliciously. And there's no good defense against it, because how do you shield a building or a city from resonance? You can't. The only defense is to never let the device start operating, and that requires surveillance and enforcement that verges on thought crime, monitoring anyone who has the knowledge and capability to build resonance weapons. I want to address the people who think this is all exaggerated or impossible. I invite you to do a simple experiment that demonstrates the principle. Take a wine glass and tap it to hear its natural frequency. It will make a ringing sound at a specific pitch. Now use a sound generator or a music app to play that exact frequency near the glass. Start quietly and slowly increase the volume. And if you hit the resonance frequency perfectly and get loud enough, the glass will shatter from nothing more than sound waves, because the acoustic energy resonates and amplifies until the glass can't handle the stress and fractures. This is the same principle as my earthquake machine, just applied to crystal structure instead of steel and concrete. And if you can shatter a glass with resonance, you can crack a building. And if you can crack a building, you can trigger a landslide. And if you can trigger a landslide, you can destabilize a fault line. It's the same physics scaling up from wine glasses to tectonic plates. And anyone who understands this and still says earthquake weapons are impossible is either ignorant of basic physics or deliberately misleading you. Let me tell you what I think should happen, but probably won't. There should be an international treaty similar to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty that specifically addresses resonance weapons, geological warfare, and environmental manipulation technologies, and this treaty should mandate that all research in this area be transparent and subject to international inspection, and any nation found to be developing or deploying earthquake weapons should face the same consequences as using weapons of mass destruction, because that's what they are. Weapons that can kill millions and destroy entire regions while leaving no proof of attack. And the fact that no such treaty exists tells me that governments want to preserve this option for themselves while denying it to others, which is exactly the wrong approach and guarantees eventual catastrophic use. I also think there should be seismological monitoring networks specifically designed to distinguish natural from artificial earthquakes. Yes, I said it's difficult, but it's not impossible. There are subtle signatures in the frequency spectrum and initiation patterns that could reveal artificial triggering if you're looking for them with sophisticated enough instruments. And if we're not looking for these signatures, it's probably because governments don't want to know. They want to maintain plausible deniability both for their own potential use and to avoid accusations from others. But this willful ignorance just means the technology will be used in shadows until one day it's used too obviously, and we have an international crisis with no framework for dealing with it. Let me make one more point about why I destroyed my oscillator and why I urge anyone recreating this technology to think very carefully before proceeding. When you build a resonance device, you're not just building a weapon or a tool. You're opening a door to consequences you cannot fully predict, because resonance is a property of systems, not of individual objects. And once you trigger resonance in one system, it can couple to other systems in ways you didn't anticipate. You might aim to shake a building and instead trigger a landslide. You might aim to affect one geological formation and instead disturb a completely different fault line. The interconnectedness of physical systems means that resonance weapons have unpredictable collateral effects. And this isn't just theoretical concern. This is why I was terrified in Houston Street when my building started shaking beyond what I had calculated, because I realized the resonance was coupling to adjacent structures in ways I hadn't modeled, and if I hadn't stopped it immediately, I genuinely don't know how far the effect would have spread. So to anyone watching this who has the knowledge and capability to build a resonance device, don't. The world has enough weapons, enough ways to kill people and destroy things. We don't need another one, and certainly not one as insidious and uncontrollable as resonance warfare. And if you think you can build it just to prove it works, or just for research purposes, you're lying to yourself, because once you prove it works, Once the knowledge exists in practical demonstrated form, it will be used by governments or criminals or terrorists, and you will bear responsibility for that use, even if you never intended it. I destroyed my earthquake machine in 1898 because I recognized its danger, and I've spent over a century regretting that I ever built it in the first place, because even though I stopped myself, even though I never published the complete specifications, the principle is simple enough that others have figured it out, and I have to live with the knowledge that my curiosity, my desire to push the boundaries of what's possible, may have contributed to technologies that could one day kill millions of people in earthquakes that appear natural but are actually weapons of war, and that's a burden I wouldn't wish on anyone. My final message to you is this: just because something is scientifically possible doesn't mean it should be built. Just because you can discover something doesn't mean you should share it. And just because technology can be developed doesn't mean it should be deployed. And resonance weapons are the perfect example of knowledge that humanity might have been better off never discovering. But since we have discovered it, since I discovered it, and others have independently discovered it, the only ethical path forward is extreme caution, international transparency, and binding agreements never to use these capabilities. And if governments won't create those agreements voluntarily, then public pressure must force them to, because the alternative is a future where every earthquake is suspect, where every natural disaster could be an act of war, where the ground beneath your feet is no longer something you can trust because someone somewhere has the ability to make it shake on command. And that's a world I hoped humanity would never have to face. But I fear it's the world we're already living in. We just don't know it yet.